Chris from the Hypro Service Department, and I'll be showing you how to work on a 9303C-HM1C hydraulically driven centrifugal pump. The tools required to work on this pump are a 1/2 inch wrench, a 9/16 wrench, a rubber hammer, 2 flat screwdrivers, a piece of metal pipe that's an inch ID by at least 4 inches long, a 1-inch PVC pipe, a 9/16 socket, a 5/8 socket, an 1 1/16 socket, a 1/4 inch Allen wrench, and some hydraulic oil. Let's get started. We'll start by removing the front housing with the 9/16 socket. On this front housing, you have a stainless steel wear ring. If there's excessive wear on the inside surface of this ring, you may notice a loss in performance of the pump. Also, if the pump is not flushed out after use, the harsh chemicals can cause excessive corrosion inside of the pump. Here's an example of a front housing from a pump that had not been flushed out after use. You can see the evidence of extreme chemical wear and corrosion even in the plug area. Another potential cause in a decrease in performance could be a worn or melted impeller. You'll want to look at this surface right here. If it's excessively worn, or if the pump may have been run dry, this could be melted. If so, replace the impeller. We'll go ahead and remove it with a 5/8 socket. You can use one of your screwdrivers to support the impeller. And then use the 2 flat screwdrivers to pry off the impeller. And examine the back side to make sure this is in good shape and it's not melted. If the pump had been run dry, the seal may be melted on this surface. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the mechanical seal. You want to take this key out first. If you need to, you could take a screwdriver and tap it out. Remove the friction ring. Take your 2 screwdrivers and pry out the mechanical seal. And examine this for any wear, any surface damage from an abrasive substance, and also if the seal is melted or cracked from being run dry. Here's an example of a seal that had been run dry. It is possible to remove the seat by prying it out with 2 screwdrivers, but this will most likely damage the seal and you'd want to replace it. We're actually going to take the flange off first and take it out from the back side. So to do that, take your 1/2 inch wrench and remove these 4 bolts. You can pull the flange straight off of the motor. Now we'll remove the seal seat from this side. If you were going to try to reuse a seal, you'd want to put a rag down or something to help protect the seal from any damage or dirt. You want to make sure that you have a very clean work area. And the seal can be tapped out from the back side gently with a screwdriver. You can also look at this area in here for excessive corrosion. Now that we've disassembled the wet end of the pump, we can get into the disassembly of the hydraulic motor. The first thing we'll do is remove the port adapters. Notice the back of the motor is marked press and tank. Press is for pressure, that's your inlet line coming in. Tank is your outlet, that's what goes back to your tank on your hydraulic system. On that port adapter, that's also marked tank. There's a check valve inside that you should be able to hear rattle. This basically keeps flow from going back into the motor. If you can't hear that rattle, take the snap ring out, take the poppet out and look for any sort of obstruction, clean it and reassemble it. If the hydraulic lines are hooked up backwards, it can cause damage to the motor seal. Let's take a look inside. Start by removing the bypass screw. Refer to your owner's manual how to set this properly according to your hydraulic system. Use your 9/16 wrench to take out the jam nut. There's a washer behind that. And you'll notice that behind that is a gasket that's included in the oil seal repair kit. In the event that you'd have to reuse this gasket, make sure you turn the bypass screw out of it instead of pulling it straight off and dragging that gasket across the threads and damaging it. Then use your 1/4" Allen to remove the bolts. It may be necessary to use your 2 flat blade screwdrivers to pry off the end plate, placing the screwdrivers underneath these tabs and being careful not to damage the surface. At this point, you can inspect the bearing, the surface of the end plate, and the G-rotor for any sort of damage or scoring that may have been caused by contaminated hydraulic oil. Next, we'll remove the G-rotor housing by gently tapping it off with a rubber hammer. Inspect this inner surface for any deep scratches or scoring that may have been caused by contaminated hydraulic oil. Notice there's a number stamped into this housing. That will help you identify which hydraulic motor model you're working on. You can also measure the thickness of this housing and use that with your owner's manual to identify which model it is. Notice there's a big pin and a small pin on here to keep you from installing it incorrectly. Next, inspect the G-rotor itself for any scratches or scoring and replace if necessary. Examine the G-rotor pin for any gouges in here just from normal operation and replace if necessary. Next, we'll remove the complete shaft and seal assembly. First, remove the slinger ring. This is to help keep water out of this bearing in the event of a mechanical seal leak on the water side of the pump. It may be necessary to take your 1-inch pipe and press down on this retaining ring to loosen it up enough to remove it. And then flip the assembly over and push out the shaft. Before removing the shaft assembly components, notice the order they're in. You have a bearing, a spacer the seal is pressed into, 2 O-rings, another spacer, a thrust washer, thrust bearing, another thrust washer, and your retaining ring. Make sure these go back in the same order they came out. To remove that retaining ring, put a corner of your screwdriver into it, twist it out. It may help to lay these components out in order on a clean surface to keep from contaminating any of these parts. You never want to drag that lip seal over this retaining ring groove. So instead we'll remove the small retaining ring on top of the bearing and press all of these components out the other side. Push this off, being careful not to damage the bearing. And we'll go to the press. Press directly on the shaft to remove the bearing and seal. At this point, examine this portion of the shaft for any excessive wear or pitting and replace as necessary. You can also examine the bearing, make sure it turns smooth and isn't tight or lumpy. That bearing is included in the hydraulic motor seal repair kit as well. You can examine the seal for any wear or damage, or if this lip is pushed out backwards the other way, the hydraulic lines were most likely reversed. To remove the seal from this cartridge, press it out. Now we're ready to reinstall. First step in reassembly will be to press the new seal into the cartridge. Place the open end of the cartridge up. Place the seal in with the lip facing up. Use that 1-inch piece of pipe, being careful not to damage the lips of the seal. Press that right down into it. Now we can reassemble our shaft assembly. Before reassembly, you want to stretch out this new seal by placing it onto the shaft facing this way, being careful not to drag it over the retaining ring groove. After stretching that out, set that aside. The next thing we'll do is reinstall the large retaining ring. Notice there's a sharp side and a rounded side to this. You want to put it on with that sharp side facing up towards the threads. Just push that on. Next, your first thrust washer. Make sure all these components are clean of any debris. Thrust bearing. Second thrust washer. And now you'll want to use this spacer included in the kit for the old style motor, with that groove facing down. Put that on, and when putting on the seal, you'll want to face the lip of it down towards the bottom of the shaft, and be careful not to roll the edge of that lip over. And center it into this spacer. Next, apply a small amount of Permatex #2 around the edge of the seal, being careful not to get it into the thrust bearings. From here we can install this into the old motor body. Use the other spacer that's included in the parts kit. Place that with the groove facing down. Make sure that your thrust washers are as centered as you can get them. Drop the assembly in, And then using a 1-inch piece of pipe, gently press this down until you feel it bottom out. Next, put the new bearing on. And press that down. Reinstall the snap ring. Notice the retaining ring groove for the smaller snap ring is inside the bearing. You have to flip this over, press that shaft back down just a little bit until you can see that retaining ring groove on the other side. Go down a little more. Now I can see that retaining ring groove again. Reinstall the small snap ring, being careful not to damage the bearing. At this point, you want to turn the shaft, make sure it turns nice and free. If it feels bound up or if it's grinding, you may have had one of the thrust washers offset. Remove the assembly, check it, and redo it. If it turns freely, give a light press until that snap ring touches the bearing. Now we're ready to reassemble the rest of the motor. Now that we've pressed the shaft assembly back into the motor housing and we've ensured that it turns freely, install a new O-ring, making sure that the O-ring groove is clean of any debris, as well as the surface of the motor body. The next thing will be to install the G-rotor pin. Put the inner portion of the G-rotor on first. Next, the outer portion. It's a good idea to put some hydraulic oil on the inner surface of this G-rotor housing. Installing it like so. Good idea to turn that from here and make sure it turns nice and freely. Put some more hydraulic oil on top of the G-rotor. And then for the end plate O-ring, putting some hydraulic oil or grease down into that groove will help hold the O-ring in place. When you flip it over and install it, make sure that O-ring doesn't come out and get pinched. And then we'll reinstall our Allen bolts and torque them to 15 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. There's where the movie magic comes in here. Everything so far so good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next, we can reinstall the bypass screw. Take the new gasket and thread it onto the bypass screw. You don't want to push it straight on and damage the gasket itself. So thread it on, leaving about 4 or 5 threads showing. Screw that in to the end plate all the way. Make sure that screw is tight. And then install the washer and the jam nut. Tighten that down with a 9/16 inch wrench. After that, you'll want to turn the shaft at this point. Make sure that everything turns nice and free. If it feels bound up or you hear grinding sounds or anything like that, you want to disassemble the motor and look for any damage or debris inside. Now we can reinstall it onto the wet end of the pump. Next, we'll put that slinger ring back onto the motor shaft. Make sure that the shaft is free of any oil. If necessary, clean it with alcohol. You want to make sure the shaft is totally dry. Next, we'll reinstall the pump flange. To do that, you'll want to start your 4 bolts by hand. And then tighten them down with your 1/2 inch wrench. Now we can install the new seal. In the 3430-0332 kit is the new seal, the new seat, the new friction ring, and a new O-ring. We'll lubricate the outer portion of the seal seat. We won't be lubricating the seal itself. Put a little oil around the edge. And then you want to make sure that the seal seat surface is clean and there are no scratches or chips in it. And to install that, drop that straight in and use that 1-inch PVC pipe. Being careful not to scratch the seal surface. Push it in till you feel it bottom out. And again, make sure that it's clean of any debris. If there's any oil on this pump shaft, make sure you clean that off. You'll notice that the shaft itself has a rough surface. The reason for this is to grab onto the inside of the seal itself, so this will rotate with the shaft and that seat stays stationary. So we'll use that PVC pipe again to install the seal, making sure that this surface is facing down towards the ceramic seat. Put the friction ring back on. The seal will need to be compressed as much as you can get it. Drop your key in. You may need to hold this steady with a screwdriver. Install the impeller. You can turn the pump by hand. Make sure that the impeller is locked onto that key. And then for the impeller nut, we'll want to put 1 drop of medium strength Loctite inside of it. Thread it on by hand. And then tighten it down with a 5/8 socket. You don't have to run that down very tight, just get it snug. And then to reinstall the new O-ring, you want to put one side on and then stretch it so it doesn't roll off of it. And now we'll reinstall the front housing. use your 9/16 wrench to tighten down these 4 bolts.
Go ahead.
The last thing is to reinstall the adapter ports with new O-rings. And we want to make sure that the one that's marked tank corresponds with where it says tank on the end plate. To tighten these down. That's it.